Well, let's start a war. That is, of course, my facetious way of beginning this lecture about the beginning of hostilities in the Civil War. But it's also pretty much what people in South Carolina were actually saying in December of 1860 and into the spring of 1861. Now, South Carolina was the first state to secede, which they did on December 20th of 1860. And, oh, by the way, it's secede, not succeed. I've heard a lot of people mispronounce that word. The Confederate States tried to secede, but we know they ultimately did not succeed. Anyway, after the secession of South Carolina, they demanded that the U.S. Army abandon all forts and posts and so forth within the borders of South Carolina, as those things they believed were on the property of South Carolina from their perspective. From the perspective of the U.S. government, of course, those facilities were on U.S. government property, and they did not withdraw those forces or abandon those places upon the demand of South Carolina. Therefore, the South Carolina militia started seizing those installations, and in Charleston, South Carolina, Charleston Harbor, a group of 85 to 90 United States soldiers withdrew to a fort there in the harbor, Fort Sumter. And as long as we are clarifying pronunciations, let me repeat, this fort is called Sumter, S-U-M-T-E-R, not Fort Sumner, as I hear it often mispronounced. So they retreat to this to this fort, and they are besieged by the South Carolina militia. In January, 2 weeks later, January the 6th, I believe, no, January the 9th, President James Buchanan, who, of course, is a lame duck president, Lincoln having been elected in November, President James Buchanan sent a ship to Charleston Harbor to reinforce and resupply this fort, but the ship was fired upon by coastal batteries there in the harbor, manned by South Carolina militia, and forced to withdraw. So they got no supplies and they got no reinforcements. As the months went on, the forces mustered there by the South Carolina militia. Now, it was not the Confederate Army, because at the time that this started happening, there was not only no Confederate Army, there was no Confederate States of America, and South Carolina was the only state that had seceded. Yet, although in early January several more did follow their lead and did wind up establishing a Confederate government and later a Confederate military. But at this point, we're talking about the South Carolina militia. This situation, of course, is what Abraham Lincoln was talking about in his inaugural address in March of 1861, when during that speech, which we looked at in some detail earlier, he said that he had taken an oath to defend the Constitution, and that meant to defend the property of the U.S. government. He said there's no reason for fighting, there's no reason we'll have a fight unless you start it, because I am bound by my oath to defend federal property. So he was talking about not just Fort Sumter, but as the Confederacy formed and as those first initial 7 states had seceded, throughout those states they were doing the same thing. They were seizing federal forts and installations. The difference was the one that they had started with in South Carolina here was very, very well fortified. Even though it had a small force, this was a stout little fort. However, by April of 1861, there was a pretty large militia force arrayed against it. The more conservative lower estimates are about 500 people, so that's more than 5-to-1 odds, and dozens of cannon. But some of the other estimates go as high as 6,000. I think it's probably safe to say at least 3,000 or 4,000 South Carolina militia were besieging this fort with roughly 90 U.S. soldiers in it. Now, by the way, another semantic note here. Of course, we've always been familiar with the terms Union and Confederacy, the Union forces or the Federal forces. Technically, what we refer to as the Union forces are the United States forces. And so I like to use that term just to reinforce that this is not some other government or some other country, or that there was this, two-way split, both of which were sort of like something new. This was the United States military and the United States government. The South Carolina militia forces were commanded by a Confederate general, in fact, one of the first people to be appointed a Confederate general, Brigadier General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard from New Orleans. A brigadier general at this point, later in the war, a full general, what today would be referred to as a four-star general, eventually. The Union forces, the U.S. forces, there in the fort were commanded by Major Robert Anderson, who himself would also be a general later in the war. And Anderson's second in command was Captain Abner Doubleday, who would also be a general by the end of the war. Captain Doubleday, once the shooting started, and I'll go ahead and tell you that South Carolina started firing upon the fort, Doubleday was the one who fired the first cannon in defense of the fort. Now, maybe that name might sound vaguely familiar to you. Abner Doubleday of Cooperstown, New York. Where have we heard that name before? And the answer is, of course, probably not in conjunction with Fort Sumter or the Civil War, but rather with professional baseball. You see, Abner Doubleday was credited, I think in 1905, Major League Baseball first made this claim, with having invented baseball. More specifically, with having come up with the rules of the game in Cooperstown, New York, in 1839, 1840, somewhere around in there. Now, that is actually a myth. There's no evidence that Abner Doubleday actually did come up with the rules for baseball. However, he did provide bats and gloves for some of his soldiers so they could play baseball in their off time. And the rules of baseball were devised in New York, though we don't know specifically that it was in Cooperstown, but it was in that area. And the game spread to the rest of the country through New Yorkers that took the game and introduced it to other people, many of them during service in the Union Army during the Civil War. So he's at least tangentially connected, even if the idea that he came up with the whole thing is almost certainly not true. But that is why Cooperstown, New York is the location of the National Baseball Hall of Fame. By March 1861, Lincoln had been inaugurated as the new president of the United States. Jefferson Davis had been inaugurated as the president of the new Confederate States. And Major Anderson and his men were still holding on there at Fort Sumter. A lot of people believe, particularly in the Confederate government, the new Confederate government in the South, that Lincoln would withdraw those troops. He would order Anderson to abandon the fort and hand it over, essentially. But Lincoln had no intention of doing that. He instead informed, actually just everybody, including the Confederacy, that he had every intention of sending several ships to Fort Sumter to bring supplies, food particularly. They were going to be out of food by April 15th completely. So he sent a fleet of supply ships with food and other things to the men at Fort Sumter, and if they received that, they would then, particularly if they also had ammunition supplied to them, then they would be able to hold out perhaps for many months more. So Davis decided that it was in the Confederacy's best interest to attack the fort before it got resupplied in an effort to take it. Now, Beauregard is still in charge. Initially, this had been a South Carolina militia action because there was no Confederacy. By April, there was a Confederacy, and the South Carolina militia was now part of it. So the order was given to Beauregard to take the fort and be quick about it before those ships arrived. And so on April 12th, General Beauregard sent a delegation to the fort to politely request that Major Anderson surrender, and Major Anderson very politely declined, and therefore the South Carolina forces opened fire on the fort. The bombardment lasted for 33 hours. During that time, as many as 3,000 cannonballs and shells were fired at the fort. Some of those cannonballs weighed as much as 128 pounds. Pounded several holes into the walls, set fire to several buildings inside the fort. And at the end of 33 hours, by this time, of course, it was April 13th, 1861, Anderson's men were completely out of ammunition, and they were going to be completely out of food in just a couple of days. Therefore, finally, he did surrender with only one condition that he asked, that they be allowed, that the U.S. forces in the fort be allowed to do a 100-gun salute to the American flag. And Beauregard allowed that. He conceded to that one condition, and so they started their salute with the cannon from inside the fort. Now, no one was actually killed in combat during this 33-hour battle. However, there were a couple of unfortunate firearms accidents that did lead to some casualties. On the Confederate side, a cannon misfired, causing one of the soldiers operating it to be to receive severe burns, from which he died. And then during that 100-gun salute, one of the Union cannon, apparently a spark floated down into the mouth of the cannon, and when they were getting ready to tamp it down and prepare it to fire, it went off prematurely, and then that killed immediately one Union soldier, an Irish immigrant, and wounded several others, one of whom later died of his injuries. So, depending how you look at it, 2 to 3 people, I tend to think that if someone died from the injury sustained in the battle, you should count him. 2 to 3 people died in the actual battle, in the actual situation, but none of them directly as a result of enemy fire, rather from the result of accidents. The first shots had been fired, and they had been fired by the Confederacy. President Lincoln issued a proclamation issuing a call for 75,000 volunteers to join the U.S. Army essentially for 3 months in order to invade the Confederate States and retake all those federal forts that the Confederates had occupied. Now, why a call for 75,000 volunteers? There were only about 16,000 people in the U.S. Army. It had been larger, but a lot of them had resigned and gone over to join the Confederate Army. So they needed a lot of people quickly, and the U.S. government, Lincoln's government, actually had quotas for each state, obviously each state still in the Union, to supply to make up this 75,000 strong force. As we talked about before, with the fire eaters in the South and the wide awakes in the North, all around the country, sort of impromptu militias had been raised already and had been training. Official militias of the various states had been expanded. And so there were a lot of people on both sides who were in the right frame of mind and to the right degree of preparation, at least to get started on an endeavor like this. It was at this point when Lincoln issued that call for volunteers and required each state, according to their population, to provide a particular number of said volunteers. It was at this point that those 4 other southern states in the upper South or the mid-South, seceded. So we're talking about Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and then lastly Tennessee in June. And then the number of states of which the Confederacy was comprised grew from 7 to 11. So that was kind of the last straw for those states as far as their decision to secede and go join the Confederacy. And in the proclamations of secession from the state legislatures from those states, there was not as much emphasis on slavery. Virginia, for example, kind of alluded to it but didn't directly mention it. But there was a lot of mention in several of them, or at least a couple of them, of the tyranny of Abraham Lincoln. A couple of them didn't give any reasons whatsoever. They just announced it was being done. I think Tennessee was one of those. But the Confederacy then grew. Now, in Virginia, the counties in the West, the overwhelming desire of the people living there was to stay in the Union and to be loyal to the United States. And eventually they seceded from the state of Virginia and became, in 1863, a state in their own right of the United States. East Tennessee almost did the same thing. It was a very close vote for East Tennessee, almost seceded from Tennessee in order to stay in the Union and be a new state in the United States. Well, okay, let's drop the well. It is worth noting that a lot of Southerners at that time and still today refer to this conflict as the War of Northern Aggression. And they usually base that on the fact that President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to invade the Confederate States, an act of aggression against them. But it is kind of odd when you think about how the whole thing started, that the South started it by seceding and then by seizing federal forts and then by firing on a federal fort in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. Some people will try to still kind of, even taking that into account, say that, well, Lincoln manipulated them into firing first because resupplying that fort rather than standing down and handing it over. So in other words, not surrendering to an act of aggression was considered by some, and still is apparently, as aggression. But I don't think that quite fits the definition of the word. I think also that a lot of people in the South, and maybe some people in the North too, had kind of underestimated or mischaracterized Abraham Lincoln. The previous two presidents, Pierce and Buchanan, had been dough-faces, Northern Democrats who kind of went along with the desires of the Southern states to perpetuate slavery. But even those that were not dough-faces, even those who were Whigs, for example, and even perhaps some Republicans, although not many Republicans had been in office for very long. It was a relatively new party. When the South started rattling their sabers, so to speak, when push came to shove, before this, all of those Northern politicians had backed off kind of at the last minute and let the Southern states have their way because they didn't want to risk any further conflict. Now, I mentioned before that Vernon Burton and other Southern historians have made the claim that Lincoln's Southernness was a factor in how he reacted to things. And we've talked about that idea of Southern honor, which is predicated on the idea that, you are dishonored, you lose face if you back down in an affair of honor. And many of the Southerners were regarding Lincoln as a Northerner, or maybe as a Westerner or a Midwesterner, thinking that he would back down, but he did not. He responded to them in the way that probably some of them would have responded, right? There's not going to be a fight unless you start it, and if you start it, I'll finish it. He did not back down and was prepared to stand his ground, even as it led to this conflict, rather than giving in, as so many politicians had done previously, therefore really prolonging this whole situation with the argument about slavery. The senior and commanding officer of the United States Army at the time the Civil War began was good old General Winfield Scott, still hanging in there at age 75. His health wasn't that great, in part because he was 75, also because he was significantly overweight. He had to be lifted up onto his horse, but his mind was still sharp, and he came up with a plan to defeat the Confederacy that would come to be known as the Anaconda Plan. And this picture on the right is from, I think, a publication that came out in 1861. Essentially, Scott sort of envisioned a lot of this victory over the Confederacy that they hoped for to come about by water. He foresaw a big blockade, which actually Lincoln was already in favor of and thinking about and getting ready to institute, a blockade of the coast. So there would be Union ships all along the Atlantic seaboard and the Gulf of Mexico to prevent any kind of foreign imports from reaching the Confederacy, or any Confederate exports, mainly cotton, from leaving and going across the ocean and generating money for the Confederacy. However, he also envisioned control of the Mississippi River, that if the river could be controlled by the U.S. forces taking all the various Confederate forts along the Mississippi, then the entire Confederacy could be encircled, could be then squeezed and cut into pieces so that they were no longer able to function effectively. Well, a lot of people in the North made fun of this plan because they were of the opinion, people in the North and South really, that this war would really be a very short thing. Each side thought that they would just march straight at the enemy and easily defeat them in a few months. So the public in the North therefore envisioned an invasion of the South, which is what Lincoln had called for, rather than this long-term strategy that Scott called for. Now, Scott himself did not continue in command for very long at all, because he recognized his advanced age and his ill health made him unsuited for the job, really physically. But as it turned out, his Anaconda plan was in fact what was instituted. Now, historians disagree as to the extent to which that contributed to the Union victory, because after all, there did also have to be a lot of fighting inland and a lot of invading, really, from the north and from the west. But there's no denying that this squeeze plan really did impair the Confederate government and the Confederate Army's ability to function. In fact, Scott recommended to President Lincoln that command of Union forces in the East, principal command of those forces in the field, be given to a man that Scott regarded almost like a son, a fellow Virginian named Robert E. Lee. And in fact, that offer was made to Lee, but he agonized over the decision. Lee himself had been opposed to secession, like a lot of Virginians. In fact, he viewed secession as a betrayal to the Constitution, but he also was in line with the thinking of a lot of secessionists where slavery was concerned, not unlike a lot of people in the Upper South, in Tennessee, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Virginia. But he did not relish the idea of taking up arms against his home state of Virginia, which had now seceded. So he had to think it over really hard for a couple of days, and ultimately he turned down the offer to be in command of the forces in the East, at least, of the Union Army. Scott was very disappointed, told him it was the biggest mistake that he would ever make. But Lee did resign from the U.S. Army and instead joined the Confederate Army. So he didn't wind up being in charge of Union forces. In this scenario, because Scott was still technically in command, this would have been the person who's doing the actual leading, sort of in the field. That wound up going to Irvin McDowell in the East, and we'll be talking more about him later. After the disastrous first major battle of the Civil War, the first battle of Bull Run, where McDowell was in command, and which Scott had helped plan, Scott did finally retire. This is just a few months into the war. When Scott retired on November 1st, 1861, he was replaced as General-in-Chief of all the Army by General George McClellan, George Brenton McClellan. McClellan was very, very popular with his troops, extremely popular. However, he was known for really being highly, highly organized to the extent that he spent most of his time organizing and often didn't get around to the fighting part, which some say is why he was so popular with his troops. He was very reluctant to engage the enemy unless he felt like he had a phenomenal advantage. Unless he had a 3-to-1 advantage, he felt uncomfortable engaging. And it was hard to gauge what that advantage was because he always overestimated the strength, the numerical strength of the enemy. He always thought he was outnumbered. And so he was very slow at getting into the battlefield. And there were several occasions that we will be talking about later on where his reluctance to engage or his reluctance to pursue when he did win a victory kept him from even his victories being more decisive than they were. There were some stalemates that arose because he just didn't act quickly enough or forcefully enough. Famous quote from President Lincoln. He wrote a note to General McClellan and said essentially, "Dear sir, if you're not going to use my army, can I borrow it?" Now, since we've been talking so much about Abraham Lincoln, and now we've started talking about Robert E. Lee, I want to address some misunderstandings and mischaracterizations around these two men that you see from time to time in social media and other places. And this particular one I have seen people quoting from several times just in the last few months. Here you have on the top a quote from Abraham Lincoln: "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." And then, in opposition to that, a quote from Robert E. Lee from before the war, not long before the war, in which he said, quote, "There's a terrible war coming, and these young men who have never seen war cannot wait for it to happen. But I tell you, I wish that I owned every slave in the South, for I would free them all to avoid this war." So this is the sort of the binary that's presented by these memes and people who are supportive of them, that essentially they're saying Lincoln wasn't really against slavery, and Robert E. Lee was against slavery. And here's another similar quote from Robert E. Lee, quote, "Mr. Blair, I look upon secession as anarchy. If I owned the 4 millions of slaves in the South, I would sacrifice them all to the Union. But how can I draw my sword upon Virginia, my native states?" Here's an image I found online that I believe is from a part of someone's presentation, from a PowerPoint presentation for, I don't know whether it was for school or what, but it was put up online, in which it lays out the facts about Robert E. Lee, regarded as the war's finest general, fought for the South due to his loyalty to Virginia, asked to lead the Union Army. And then, at the bottom of that list of facts, opposed slavery. Now, this idea that Robert E. Lee was anti-slavery, actually it predates the internet or internet memes. I remember 30-some years ago when I was in my 20s believing that Robert E. Lee was anti-slavery because I read it somewhere. And, you know, it's understandable how someone might come to that conclusion, because there are a lot of quotes out there from Robert E. Lee, actual quotes, things that he actually said, in which he talks about how bad slavery was, and even immoral and wicked and evil. The most famous example being from this 1856 letter to his wife, in which he said, quote, "In this enlightened age, there are few, I believe, but what will acknowledge that slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil in any country," which would seem to put Lee at the opposite end of the spectrum from Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who said, quote, "My own convictions as to Negro slavery are strong. It has its evils and abuses. We recognize the Negro as God and God's book and God's laws in nature tell us to recognize him, our inferior, fitted expressly for servitude. You cannot transform the Negro into anything 1/10 as useful or as good as what slavery enables them to be." So Davis, right in line with his Vice President Alexander Stephens, whose cornerstone speech we read quite a bit of in a couple of lectures back. And this is often how it is presented in pop culture, popular history, that Jefferson Davis was the bad slavery guy, and that Robert E. Lee was the highly principled person who was philosophically opposed to the very idea of slavery, but was fighting to defend his home state. Well, there are some problems with that, and the biggest problem is, the broadest problem, is it does not consider context. Okay? It takes random quotes, isolates them, without showing what was really being said, and even beyond that, which we'll discuss in a minute, going into a little more detail about the cultural background of what is being said and how. For example, that quote we saw earlier in the letter from Lee to his wife, none of the memes or the people who quote that tell you what he then said immediately afterwards. So here is some context. "In this enlightened age, there are few, I believe, but what will acknowledge that slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil in any country. It is useless to expatiate on its disadvantages. I think it, however, a greater evil to the white than to the black race, and while my feelings are strongly interested in behalf of the latter, my sympathies are more strong for the former. The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise and merciful providence." Now, does that sound like somebody who is philosophically opposed to the very principle of slavery and thinks that slaves should be freed? Not at all. He is in some ways taking the opposite tack still from Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, who said black people are inferior and not good for anything else and never will be other than slavery. No, Lee is saying slavery's bad, slavery's wrong, but on the other hand, they really need to experience it because they need that discipline to teach them as a race. And we don't know how long, it's God's plan for them to endure that until they have learned how to take care of themselves and be more advanced. So one might, on the surface, seem to be just a little bit more empathetic, but they're both saying they should be slaves. One just says they should be slaves forever, and the other, Lee, says they should be slaves. I'm not sure how long. All right. So let's go back to this meme and see what is actually being said. Now, the implication of the meme is Lincoln is fine with slavery, is for slavery, and Lee is opposed to it. But it's actually the opposite. And what's being said is that here Lincoln, who is against slavery by principle, is saying that even so, if it would save the Union to not free any slaves at all, he would do that to save the Union. Lee, who does believe in slavery and support slavery and have slaves, we'll get to that in a moment, he is saying that nonetheless he would give up those slaves. In fact, if he owned them, he'd give up all 4 million slaves in the South to avoid war and save the Union. So Lincoln isn't saying, I hate the idea of freeing slaves, and Lee isn't saying, I love the idea of freeing slaves. They're both saying, we want to avoid a war and we want to save the Union, and we would sacrifice this other thing we believe in order to achieve that end if it were necessary. But wait, hold on, you might say. What's this about Lee owning slaves? All those memes say Lee was opposed to slavery. Lee didn't own slaves. Some quotes, I don't know of any memes, but some quotes will acknowledge that Lee inherited slaves and then set them free. The implication being because he was opposed to slavery. Okay, so here also is where it's important to understand context. Here you need to understand the context of the timeline of events. Yes, Robert E. Lee inherited slaves from his father-in-law when his father-in-law passed away, and those slaves were later freed. Here's the important thing. First of all, it was not Lee's decision to free them. Second of all, it was much later that happened. So here's the story. Here's what really happened. Lee's father-in-law, on his deathbed, in his will, stipulated that his slaves be freed. Lee inherited these slaves. 5 years went by. They were not freed yet. He actually wound up, I think he was accused of disobeying his father-in-law's wishes, and there were some newspaper articles about this. He wrote, I think, to the New York Times about it. What happened was that he went to court. Robert E. Lee went to court to try to block his father-in-law's will, setting these slaves free. And it languished in court for a while. That whole while that it was languishing in court, they were still his slaves. And they were his slaves until, they were still his slaves when the Civil War started. While they were his slaves, he practiced the same methods that other slave owners did to ensure the obedience of slaves. And particularly runaway slaves were punished in gruesome ways at the command of Robert E. Lee, who we now know from his letter to his wife believed that it's God's will that they suffer slavery, right? So it's not like he just inherited these slaves and just by his own kind of magnanimous nature set them free. He tried everything he could to avoid them being set free. And he also, there's plenty of quotes, plenty of evidence of him being opposed to the idea of limiting the spread of slavery to the West. There's also the fact that when he led the invasion of Pennsylvania that led to the Battle of Gettysburg, any black people that his soldiers came upon, they were ordered by Lee to capture those free black people and take them back with them to the South and sell them into slavery. All right, so it may seem like I'm emphasizing this quite a bit. It's because there is such an uphill climb and an upstream swim to counter the mythology that has developed that seems to promote the idea that if Abraham Lincoln wasn't really against slavery, and if Robert E. Lee was very much against slavery, then the Civil War couldn't have really been about slavery, could it? It must have been about other things. And that's what's at the root of these types of serious stretching of the historical facts. And a lot of people who pass this stuff on don't realize how non-factual it is because they just take the word of whoever is sending it to them, in part because that's what they want to believe. Now, this stuff about Lee talking about the evils of slavery. What's going on with that? Well, does it sound at all familiar to you? Because if you've listened to all these lectures, it should. It sounds very much like the things that Thomas Jefferson used to say. Oh, slavery's terrible. I would, if I could, I'd get rid of it tomorrow. We're stuck with it. It really is impossible for us to get rid of it in our lifetime, but boy, I wish we could. It's an evil that England imposed upon us, and sort of against our will, we have to deal with it. He said all those things, and so did other slave holders of his generation, other of the quote-unquote founding fathers, talked often about how bad and evil slavery was, and yet many of the ones who were from the South still owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson owned a lot of slaves, made a lot of money from his slaves, talked about how bad slavery was, but didn't free his slaves, and did not promote the abolition of slavery. He did say he hoped it would gradually pass away. Now, if you will recall, not very long ago, just a few lectures back, we talked about this guy, Alexander Stephens, Vice President of the Confederate States of America, and the speech that he gave in the spring of 1861, which is known as the Cornerstone Speech, in which he asserted that white supremacy, the inferiority of African Americans, of black people, white supremacy and slavery were the cornerstone that this new country, the Confederate States of America, was built upon, and that it was enshrined in the Confederate Constitution, which is what made it superior to the United States Constitution. Remember all that? Remember how also he mentioned Thomas Jefferson. He said a long time ago, back when they were writing the Constitution and those other things, Thomas Jefferson said all these things about slavery being bad and slavery being evil, and we know now that he was just misinformed. He didn't really understand, as well as we do today in 1861, that slavery is the natural order of things and is actually a good thing. Jefferson kept saying it was bad. In his speech, Stephens said, perhaps some of you listening to me now, he was giving this speech in Savannah, perhaps some of you listening to me now remember that just as recently as 20 years ago, some of the older people were saying stuff like that. They were saying stuff like slavery's bad, would be better off without it, wish we could get rid of it. But that's because they were uninformed. Now, why am I talking about that speech by Alexander Stephens and the things that Thomas Jefferson said? Because look at that in conjunction with Robert E. Lee. He was making the same arguments Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers who were slave owners had made. He was making the same arguments that, according to Alexander Stephens, old people made. Well, he was a little bit on the older side. He was in his 50s. And in fact, his father had been one of those founding fathers. Robert E. Lee was born late in life to his father. So he would have, as a child, heard a lot of those same arguments from people who owned slaves, didn't want to get rid of slavery, but did feel guilty enough about it that they talked about how bad and wrong it was and how they hoped it went away someday. All that's what Robert E. Lee is saying. So that, well, does that mean he opposed slavery? No. Did Thomas Jefferson oppose slavery? No, he had slaves. What that really shows, those things that Robert E. Lee said, that if you look at them kind of randomly, might look like he opposes slavery, just like some of the things Thomas Jefferson said. What that really shows is how old-fashioned Robert E. Lee was. He had not caught on to the newer way of looking at things that had come about over the last 10 or 15 years, and he was still defending slavery the old-fashioned way, kind of in a roundabout way, rather than just full tilt, full bore, jump right in and talk about how great it is. And all of this reminds me of another set of memes or claims that I see going around often about Abraham Lincoln. You see, and there's plenty of quotes to back this up. It was a thing. Throughout the 1850s, Abraham Lincoln, when he talked about the evils of slavery and the need for slavery someday to end, would kind of connect that with the idea that, but those freed slaves need to be sent back to Africa, right? Because, he would say, there's no way they could live in peace with white people. So, slavery is bad. Hopefully someday it'll end. When it does, got to send them all back to Africa. He was still saying that after the beginning of the Civil War. He was saying that as late as 1862. And he was even sort of like making some moves in his administration to sort of expedite that for freed slaves, for runaway slaves at that point, I guess, until some African American leaders confronted him about it, including Frederick Douglass. Now, again, if you have been listening to all these lectures, this will sound familiar to you, because back in the 1820s and 1830s into the 1840s, when the abolition movement was becoming a thing in the United States, the vast majority of abolitionists, at least of white abolitionists, promoted this same idea. It went all the way back to the late 18 teens. Colonization, the colonization movement, it was called. It's what led to the creation of the country of Liberia, which started off as a colony for former slaves from the United States. So almost all the major abolitionists were saying this stuff back then, until more and more black abolitionists, people like David Walker and later Frederick Douglass, took them to task and pointed out that African Americans, black people in America, are Americans, that they are as much American as anyone else born here, and that they had helped to build this country and wanted to have a part in this country and would not stand for the idea of being shipped off. So, over the course of the 1840s, that argument, and again, you'll remember this from the lectures, that argument started to get through to the white abolitionists, and they stopped talking about this return them all to Africa business and started calling instead for the abolition of slavery and for civil rights for African Americans. So Lincoln, kind of repeating those same talking points and believing those same things about colonization, does not mean he was against abolition. It shows how old-fashioned he was. He was around the same age as Robert E. Lee. After all, he was in his 50s, and he too was promoting ideas that abolitionists had been promoting 20, 30 years before that. So, what does it mean when you see people sending around quotes and memes like that? They're trying to give the idea that Lincoln didn't really mind slavery, and he certainly wasn't trying to free black people and give them civil rights. That's the idea there. Now, again, if you've been following along some of the things that we've read, just some of the quotes from Lincoln, you'll know that his primary interest was not ending slavery in the South, but keeping it from spreading to the West, because of that concept of free labor ideology that was sort of the foundation for the Republican Party that we talked about earlier. And finally, here's one more meme. This is the last one that I'll talk about. And, you might find yourself thinking, gee, this guy needs to spend less time on social media. But that's not really my point in talking about this stuff. It's because these ideas catch on, and people develop a skewed understanding of history and really of reality. And it's important to address those things. So this one, you can see there, Ulysses S. Grant, slave owner, Robert E. Lee, not slave owner. Well, we know Robert E. Lee's story now. What's the story with Ulysses S. Grant, who, spoiler alert, will wind up being in overall command of the Union Army and then later be president? Well, Ulysses S. Grant was from Ohio. His father had been an abolitionist who refused to even live in a slave state, but Ulysses Simpson Grant, or Sam Grant as he was known, when he grew up, he was just kind of neutral on the whole thing. Didn't spend a lot of time, it seems, thinking about it. And he wound up marrying into a family that owned slaves. His wife's father owned slaves. And there were a lot of interactions between Grant and his father-in-law, and therefore his father-in-law's slaves. Now, witnesses from the time have talked about the fact that when Grant interacted with his father-in-law's slaves, it was to get out there and work with them, and that he never wielded any kind of a whip or anything like that, because he was not a slave. He was not a pro-slave person, but he was around it, okay? And in 1858, he wound up with a slave, a male slave. And we're not sure if he bought this slave himself or if it was a gift, maybe, from his father-in-law. What we do know is that within a year, Grant freed that slave. So that was his one experience with slave owning. He had a slave for a few months and then set them free. Okay, so compare that to Robert E. Lee, who had 200 slaves that he punished harshly and tried like the dickens to get out of having to set free. Okay, so these are not to be equated, nor are they to be flipped over. This makes it look like Grant was pro-slavery and Lee was opposed to slavery, which we know now was not true. So again, why do memes like this persist? It's because if U.S. Grant was pro-slavery, or if U.S. Grant owned slaves, and you can believe that Robert E. Lee did not own slaves and was opposed to slavery, then the Civil War must not have been about slavery, right? It must have been about something else. And that is a fiction. It is a fiction how these things are presented and selectively quoted from. It's also a fiction that the war wasn't about slavery. Remember all the stuff that we read about people forming the Confederacy, talking at length about how it was to protect slavery and maintain the position that black people were inferior. Okay? So there's lots of quotes out there that you will see, maybe attached to memes, maybe not, but there's lots of quotes out there from people like Jefferson Davis and other Confederate leaders in which they say the war's not about slavery at all. Well, when you see quotes like that, try to find some kind of attribution. Try to find the source. And when you do, take note of when they said these things. Was it before the war started, when the Confederacy was being formed, and they were out there, talking about why they wanted to secede and why they wanted to form their own country? Or was it after the war was over and the Confederacy had lost and slavery had ended? Because their story changed after the war. But that's not what we look at to find their motivations, what they said after the fact when circumstances had changed. We look at what they said and what they did at the beginning when it was actually happening.